Listen, we just gave them the coordinates and who we suspected of being communists. We didn't tell them that they should use the guns that sometimes they got from us on their unsuspecting civilian population. How could we have known that? Who could have thought that they would end up slaughtering every single person, of suspected communist allegiances? They were slaughtering motherfuckers who were like, yeah, I think women and men should be equal. They were slaughtering people. Many of them were involved in student protests and student organizing. They were slaughtering people who wanted to engage in any sort of like pro-democracy initiative, for example. So a lot of this stuff doesn't stop with it. It went far beyond that. They would just kill intellectuals. They would kill people for the crime of saying like, yeah, I don't know if we should do this. It never stops with just the communists. They do not want any sort of fucking opposition whatsoever. That is so crazy. Maybe I might be coming across as like a cynic or a little bitter. And I guess there's some truth to that. I am a little bitter because I look at this moment of celebration and I cherish it. I think it's amazing. It's impressive. But of course, I also have a tremendous amount of envy because when I saw this image, at least the top down image of potentially 1 million people that were outside of the Capitol building waiting for the results of this impeachment to come in, I couldn't help myself but feel a little bit of envy when I saw the joy. I yearned to feel this joy one day in America, I said. And the reality is, I don't think we ever will. I think that's another materialist perspective. Koreans do not get paid for their labor, so this ability to put on a general strike within hours, they have seemingly less to lose and more reason to create solidarity and organize. Yeah, their labor unions are interesting. They have a lot of organizational power, but they're ultimately powerless in the face of like chaeballs in general. Even though they do end up doing like work stoppages and stuff, but the unions had a general strike ready to go in like less than 12 hours. A lot of people misunderstand Koreans as good at protesting. There's an extensive history of oppression of protests, which plays a huge role in their willingness to show out. Yeah, exactly. I think they also understand that they have protection in numbers, and they demonstrated that instantly in the night of the martial law declaration, and they continue to demonstrate that by showing up every single fucking day. I feel like we should do a deeper dive into many of the uprisings that took place that the American-backed authoritarian government actually very violently squashed, both in the lead up to the Korean War, but also in the aftermath of the Korean War as well. Because we played a pretty formative role in the development of South Korea. And not only that, but also, we played a pretty formative role in the maintenance of the authoritarian military rule in South Korea because it benefited us. Another bulwark against potential growth of communism in the region, another military base to be placed. And in that process, if you were to be violent with anyone and everyone that you personally thought was a threat to the established order, you could simply call a communist sympathizer and kill them. And many were killed. I think this plays a pretty big role in the current material conditions of South Korean existence. It's important to understand it better.
South Korea's parliament voting to impeach President Yoon Suk-yeol this morning. The news was met with cheers by opponents of Yoon's.
I'm jealous, dude. I'm jealous. I see this level of organizing. I see this level of action, and I see the reaction from the government, and I can't help but feel a little jealous, man. I can't help. Now, of course, having said that, will this actually improve the day-to-day existence of South Koreans? Of course not. But it doesn't matter. Like, this is a brief moment where they actually took to the streets and it worked. You know what I mean? This is what it feels like when I see people in other countries get free healthcare, and I'm like, why can't it be us? It's crazy. Maybe if you taught us, maybe if you spent 2 weeks out of the year not reacting to the zeitgeist and just directing the rest of us, many of us don't have time to figure this shit out on our own. What are you talking about? Everything that I do is literally hand-holding you through this fucking process. The fuck? Yeah, it's my fault that America is the heart of Red Scare propaganda. It is the heart of empire, and it very successfully destroyed any kind of labor militancy that it used to have. And one fucking Twitch streamer on an Amazon subsidiary corporation is going to lead the revolution.
People Power Party. The move to oust Yoon comes less than 2 weeks after he briefly declared martial law. That decision was unanimously overturned by.
It's not your fault, but you aren't part of the solution. Do you guys think you come across as like intellectual when you say dumb shit like this? That chatter is asking for direct action the same way so many chatters were asking you to tell them what to write in to represent an anti-genocide vote in November, and all we got were jokes about voting Biden. Yeah, you're right. I should have advocated for Jill Stein as a principled anti-genocide voter, even though I don't agree with her. I think a lot of you want hand-holding beyond the amount of hand-holding that I give you in terms of like where to go for organizing. You know, very frustrating. People saw that one tweet and decided they wanted to bring that energy into the chat. I know. I was saying dumbass shit adjacent to these chatters as recently as last June. Please understand that this is just lashing out at allies as a part of the pipeline. You are doing a great thing. This anger is arguably a good sign. Yeah, not really. I think everyone has a little wrecker tendency in their brains, and they just kind of sometimes feed into it. Yeah, my goal is to get you to understand the way that the system is designed and then point you in the right direction, which is what I do all the time. If your arguments are, hey, why don't you just fucking stop the streaming shit because you're not a part of the solution, and, you know, rise up in arms and lead the militant vanguard that does not exist into a revolution, then, you know, you're kind of hallucinating an alternative reality. I look at the current material conditions, I look at the current culture and the attitude that people have. We have no labor unions as the backbone, and the labor unions that we have do not exhibit any sort of labor militancy in general. So if you currently think that, this is why I'm anti-accelerationism as well. If you currently think that like some kind of accelerationism is going to magically bring about a socialist revolution and instill class consciousness in the minds of many Americans, you simply have not gone outside and talked to your fellow neighbors. Okay? That's it. You need to be able to have labor unions and labor unions to have the courage to be able to actually fight, to be able to get to that point to begin with. This is part of the reason why I do not have issues with social democracy at this stage in American consciousness. I don't think that American social democrats are outside of the sphere of anti-capitalist sentiment in this country because of how hyper-capitalist and hyper-individualist and American chauvinist Americans are. Okay? That's it. Some of you literally chirp in the chat and sound like Disco Elysium NPCs from time to time.
Parliament. Chris Livesay is following the developments in our London newsroom. Chris, good morning.
Good morning. Well, it's the culmination of weeks of turmoil in South Korea, this critical American ally on China's doorstep. This morning, tensions are boiling. The moment the impeachment bill was passed, a mix of loud gasps and cheers when the...
It's like when people obsess over AOC rather than the 150 pro-Israel congresspeople in the Democratic caucus, you're focusing on one person that feels like you that has power rather than face the daunting reality that we have a lot of work to do. Thank you. Michael from Pennsylvania once again. Michael from Pennsylvania once again with another banger. Exactly. You have to understand that you have to rate people on a curve. You have to grade people on a curve. It comes with the recognition of what the broader space looks like, what the societal attitudes look like. It's always funny whenever motherfuckers come in here and they're like, why aren't you reading Lenin right now?
Speaker announced enough votes were cast against the president, some from his own party. Outside at opposing rallies, some were dismayed while others rejoiced over his impeachment. A crisis was sparked back on December 3rd when the president declared martial law. He said to withstand disorder and what he alleged were pro-North Korean elements inside the opposition. But the backlash was so intense, the decision was reversed just hours later. This morning, President Yoon is not backing down, vowing, "I will never give up." He's still in office for now, but the country's constitutional court must now deliberate on whether to uphold the impeachment. And if it stands, a new election will follow. Dana.
It's been interesting to watch from afar, Chris. Thank you.
Now to Syria, America.
Let's do which video could we watch that features more of the historical context, blowback style of South Korean politics that isn't like unimaginably reactionary? I know Blowback's entire season is fantastic, but I want just finished Blowback season 3 today. It was so good. Chat, it's all Korean War and its aftermath. Just listen to the last bonus episode. Starts with Young Suk Yeol being a pro-US anti-reunification hardliner in the summer of 2022. What is this, Mr. Beast?
This video is sponsored by Brilliant.
North Korea and South Korea compared. I don't know if this is good or not. I am always worried about YouTube historians. Dude, if you ask one more time to fucking do a David Harvey capital, okay. All right, I'm gonna start banning people. Mods, you can ban people too that ask questions like, "Can you do a theory stream?" No, the answer is no. Okay, let's do the Mr. B video.
North Korea is also called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. That's a good one. Anyway, two East Asian countries on the Korean peninsula that are opposite in so many ways. And yet, not that long ago, relatively speaking, they were just one country, Korea. Yeah, this one's gonna be lopsided, folks. I'll start by showing you this, which many of you have probably seen before. One picture sums up so much, doesn't it? Most already know South Koreans enjoy a much higher standard of living and much more freedoms, but in this video, let's dig a bit deeper. That said, since North Korea is such a secretive country, there's a lot we don't know about. But it's difficult for North Korea to hide the fact that South Korea is doing so much better than it, based on a variety of factors. First,
I hope that as a history teacher, that's what people are saying, that he understands why there are vast differences in the development of South Korea versus North Korea, and maybe even Okay, chat, this isn't your opportunity to send me whatever like you Google and the first thing you found out from Google on YouTube. I appreciate the many chatters that are trying to help, but like you're just sending me some crazy shit. There's a chatter in here sending me like a fucking DPRK news agency video, and it's like, calm down.
First, what do they have in common? Well, both are made up of mostly Koreans, you silly goose, and residents of both speak Korean. That said, residents of both have developed different Korean dialects over the past several decades, since residents of both barely interact. In addition, since it's taught widely in school, around 45% of South Koreans also speak English. The largest city in both is also the capital, although Seoul is much larger than Pyongyang. South Korea even has a second capital, Sejong, where many of the government's most important agencies are located. There is a culture in both that values communitarianism, or the greater good over individual liberty. Both have
If he doesn't talk about Neo-Confucianism, I'm out.
Similar climates and have 4 seasons, although it does get much colder in the winter in North Korea and a bit warmer in the summer in South Korea. Much of North Korea has either a temperate continental climate or warm continental climate. Much of South Korea also has a warm continental climate, but along its east coast it has an oceanic climate and a humid subtropical climate in the south. Both are affected by annual monsoons. Both Both are affected by occasional droughts and flooding, but overall South Korea gets more annual precipitation. Both border the East Sea, or Sea of Japan, to the east, and the Yellow Sea to the west. Both are separated by the 2.5 kilometer wide, 250 kilometer long DMZ, or Korean Demilitarized Zone, which is probably the most dangerous border in the world. Tens of thousands of troops and dozens of forts line the DMZ, and it has around 2 million mines near it. Oh, and a bunch of wild tigers, since it's basically wilderness now since so few humans dare try to cross it. Believe it or not, a handful of North Koreans have tried in recent years. One North Korean man tried and got shot at by his own troops 40 times. That all said, there is a meeting point at the DMZ where South Korean and North Korean officials can meet and negotiate stuff. It's called the Joint Security Area, and it's actually a place where tourists can visit too. It's the only place where North Korean and South Korean soldiers can stand side by side. So anyway, why the heck is the DMZ such a heavily guarded border? Well, I suppose we ought to get into some history here. Okay, a very brief history. Humans have lived on the Korean Peninsula for at least 10,000 years. Around 4,500 years ago, these humans developed kingdoms in the area. There was the Proto Three Kingdoms period.
He went back too far. He went back too far. I thought he would go to Neo-Confucianism. He went back way,
the Cold War in
way further than I thought, bro. Goddamn.
Three Kingdoms period, Northern and Southern States period, and later Three Kingdoms period. It wasn't until 918 that the entire peninsula was united by a dude named Wang Gian, who founded the kingdom of Goryeo. The Mongols invaded in the 1200s and sort of held a grip over Goryeo until the mid-1300s. In 1392, General Yi Sung-gai established the Joseon dynasty after overthrowing the Goryeo dynasty 4 years prior. Shout out to King Sejong the Great, who put into place lots of reforms and even created the Korean alphabet during the 1400s. In 1592, the Japanese began invading the Korean peninsula, but after a few years, the Joseon dynasty was able to hold them off with the help of the Ming dynasty of China. Throughout the 1600s and 1700s, the peninsula under Joseon rule became more isolationist and a bit stagnant, developing technology. By the mid-1800s, European imperialist powers were trying to interfere, but the Joseon dynasty couldn't do much to stop them and was forced to sign treaties in which they were screwed over. A series of crazy events in the late 1800s led to the creation of the Korean Empire. During its existence, the peninsula quickly modernized and there were big reforms. In 1905, after it won the Russo-Japanese War, Japan was like, Korea, what's up now? So Korea signed a treaty with Japan in which it became controlled and protected by Japan in return for peace. Well, Japan went ahead and annexed the Korean Empire 5 years later. However, even as the annexation was taking place, a growing Korean independence movement was brewing on the peninsula. After Japan quickly crushed the March 1st movement, many Korean leaders fled to China. For the next 35 years, most of the resistance movements were organized by exiled leaders in Manchuria, China, and Siberia, influenced by many peaceful demonstrations within Japanese-controlled Korea. Jump ahead to World War II, and the Allied powers defeat the Empire of Japan, resulting in a free Korea. Okay, well, maybe not so free, since the Allied powers now occupied it with their militaries. The Allies divided the peninsula at the 38th parallel into a northern area protected by the Soviet Union and a southern area protected mostly by the United States. However, as you could imagine, the Soviet Union and the United States had different visions for what a future Korea should be. After not being able to agree on a government, the 38th parallel became the boundary for the two countries this video is about. In 1950, Kim Il-sung, the new leader of North Korea, launched an invasion of South Korea to try to reunify Korea, but under communist rule. This led to a 3-year war that...
Okay, no, never mind. We're not just doing that, I think. Okay, I'm gonna watch the Hawking video instead.
Does North Korea hate the US? An irrational hatred for American freedoms? A crazy leader? Jealousy? Sadly, no. The answer lies in what they perceive to be decades of unprovoked US aggression that has left deep and lasting scars on the Korean Peninsula. The arbitrary division of Korea in 1945 and the devastating US bombing campaigns that followed during the Korean War are not distant memories. The mass death at American hands shaped a collective memory and a strong spirit of resistance against foreign domination, especially the US. For North Korea, the hostility against the US and its allies is easily seen as a reasonable defensive posture, a refusal to submit to the US-dominated hegemonic world order that denies independence to nations unwilling to bend to foreign policy interests of the US. Back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Conflict of Nations. History has shown us how strategy, alliances, and bold decisions.
So is Felicia the video that agrees with you? No. This understanding of the Korean War is super basic, and it doesn't serve the purpose of what I am trying to offer to the chatters, which is that it's Kim Il-sung's a bad guy. He invades South Korea, and then Americans valiantly defend the interests of South Korea. When it's good. It's not like, it's not necessarily bad. It just doesn't serve the purpose of what I want to examine, which is what the South Korean leadership looked like, the actions that they took against their own population, claiming that they were fucking communist sympathizers. It's oversimplified. That's it. Skip directly to World War II, then skip directly to the invasion from the north, skipping over the entire background of the conflict. Yeah. I mean, it also has, I don't even think that this is like hyper biased or anything. I'm not even going to say that. It just more so skips cultural context because it has very limited time. And if you go all the way back to the development of Korea, but then you skip over even like Japanese colonialization and the resistance movement against such things, like there's a lot that goes into like understanding the the historical context that goes into understanding contemporary South Korean society. Like if you look at this and you think, oh well, it's the big bad North backed by the USSR that like simply invaded South Korea without and assume that like every single person was like violently against allegiances to even socialism, you fail to understand why the South Korean leadership executed so many people, specifically because they did not want to have any sort of any sort of unification. They did not want any sort of resistance against their dictatorship, and how beneficial this was for America's interests in creating a bulwark against growing communism in the region. There's always this like monolithizing of both our foreign adversaries and also monolithizing of our foreign allies as well. The understanding that like trade unionist movements, feminist movements, like movements that were socially progressive, were regarded as pro-USSR and violently squashed in South Korea. And I think that plays a big role in how you arrive at the current Korean political system that is basically also another version of the duopoly that we see in the United States of America, with a relatively right-wing liberal party and also a somewhat more right-wing, further right-wing liberal party. This is the reason why when you see labor militancy, you don't actually have, even if there is labor militancy, you don't actually personally have some kind of result or any sort of like political group that you can lean on to demonstrate your interests. And I think that it's important to understand how the ownership of the South Korean economy virtually exchanged hands and went from authoritarian rule to a neoliberal rule that dictated that 6 families virtually own the entirety of the Korean economy. These very wealthy families. So all of that, I think, plays a role in any sort of protest movement, in the examination of any sort of protest movement and where it goes, and how it plays a very formative role in the way that South Koreans, especially young South Koreans, view the existence of South Korea as a living hell, because all of that plays a role in having a lot of these societal harms left unaddressed. Mr. Beat has openly stated how he's against American imperialist actions against popular communist movements. I want chat to know that. Yeah, I don't know what his political background is at all. I'm not making assertions about his political ideology. I'm simply stating that it is this was relatively reductive because he has 22 minutes to explain this complex subject matter And I think it would be more interesting to just look at it from a hyper-specific perspective. Just like look at why the DPRK resents America from the lens of like the Korean War, for example. That's what it was. That's the reason why I was going to click away from it. Not because I have any issues with Mr. Beat whatsoever.
That ultimately resulted in the deaths of around 5 million people, including a larger proportional civilian death toll than World War II. The war was indeed devastating and displaced millions of Koreans. The Soviet Union and China aided North Korea, and the United States and several other United Nations countries aided South Korea. It ended basically in a stalemate with an armistice and that DMZ I was talking about earlier. Technically speaking, the Korean War never ended, and I can tell you, even though the armistice was signed 68 years ago, the war is still fresh in the minds of both North Koreans and South Koreans. For the first few decades after the war ended, both countries had authoritarian regimes. However, in South Korea, the people ultimately didn't put up with it. Until the 1980s, South Korea had much political turmoil and instability. However, since 1987,
I know it's the wrong video. I went back to it. I wanna show you this.
June democracy movement, South Korea has had a competitive electoral system and a fairly stable government. North Korea has had a stable government since the war, but has successfully kept the authoritarianism. Meanwhile, economically, both countries did fairly well in the decades following the war. South Korea liberalized its economy, becoming more market-based, and for 40 years saw huge economic growth. In fact, some even called it the miracle on the Han River. Both were admitted into the United Nations in 1991, but it was around that time that things went to crap for North Korea. After the Soviet Union collapsed, they lost a bunch of aid, and their economy sharply declined.
And a massive fucking embargo that continuously starved the North Korean population. A lot of people don't know that. Yeah, I mean, there's so many aspects of this that are not mentioned. Like, North Korea was a industrial powerhouse for Korea overall, and that North Korea was virtually destroyed. I believe, what is it, like 70% of all standing civilian infrastructure was destroyed. The American bombing campaigns, and even the American bombing campaigns, and even the potential chemical weapons, chemical warfare, biological warfare that they engaged in, with all of the information that they had gotten from Japanese war criminals that they did not prosecute, so that they could get this information, specifically the research that was taken from the Japanese imperial actions in Manchuria and many other places. Unit 731 was utilized in North Korea in the hands of the American military and also all of the other allied nations. And in spite of that, North Korean development early on was pretty good early on. But a lot of Americans and a lot of people just generally don't know that, partially because of how diminished voices that are in the crosshairs of American empire are, but also partially because, I mean, they were in the orbit of the USSR, and mainstream media at the time was infinitely more centralized, and most people don't know that. Most significantly, however, everything that you know about North Korea is the post-famine North Korea. Okay? In the aftermath of the USSR collapsing, America was the victor of the Cold War. Capitalism won. Socialism lost. Okay? For many different reasons. I'm not going to get into it now. But most people only know North Korea as like the post-90s North Korea, when the massive embargoes placed upon North Korea only made things infinitely worse in terms of the widespread famine that they were experiencing. So much starvation, mass deaths. The Korean War wasn't the only blow against the Korean population. It wasn't the only genocidal action that American empire took against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Having said all of that, I am not a based DPRK Jusha supporter, or say that what do you call it, or say things like people are eating burger every day in North Korea or anything like that. Okay. I am not confused about having the family lineage get passed down. Like, I know what that is. That's not democracy. Okay. That is not the Democratic People's Republic. You can't, the people are not, the people are not going, oh my God, this benevolent dictator and his next of kin are so fucking good. That's why we keep voting for them over and over again. That's not how this works. Okay. Yeah, it is not a democracy. Anyway, let's continue.
Just as South Korea's economy dramatically improved. In the 1990s, North Korea experienced floods and droughts. This, combined with no longer importing food from the Soviet Union, ultimately led to what became known as the North Korean famine. Some estimate up to 600,000 North Koreans died. North Korea has since somewhat recovered, but yeah, I'm hoping you realize already why these two countries are so...
No, their recovery has been pretty solid over all things considered. If you're rating it on a curve, just like Cuba, you have to look at like what their starting position is and what they have arrived at this point. Having said that, there's still a tremendous amount of political repression as well. For the record, I'm not discounting that at all. Like, I would never do that. And then the same that goes for even like Chinese civil liberties. When we talk about China, many people say, Hasan, you're refusing to recognize many of the countries that find themselves outside of the sphere of American influence engage in certain levels of social and political repression. Part of that is defensive posture that even the likes of America has exhibited time and time again in times of war. America has also done that when it's not directly in hot war, but during the Cold War. Part of that is the reason why so many people have the wrong opinion or are completely oblivious to the nature of Marxism, Marxist-Leninism, socialism, or any kind of anti-capitalist sentiment. It's the Red Scare. It's McCarthyist trials. It's blackballing and sometimes even imprisoning socialists and communists alike. Okay, that is social and political repression utilized by the American state. Social and political repression utilized by the American state during World War II was infinitely worse. As a matter of fact, if you recall, we, put up internment camps for every member that was a Japanese American. Okay, it doesn't get more social and political repression than that. Okay, and that was in a dark period of American history, seen as necessary repression during times of war. It was fucking shameful. It was unimaginably racist. I don't think we've ever actually reckoned with that at all. But just so you understand, governments, all governments, this is not like pro or anti-American, it's not pro or anti-China or pro or anti-Cuba. All governments in times of need see political repression as a tool, as a necessary defense. In the instance of a country like Cuba that has withstood endless cruelty in the hands of American empire for the crime of rising up and revolting against America's aligned dictatorship, okay? A dictatorship that we offered weapons to so they could continue slaughtering Koreans because it was beneficial for us to have Cuba as a tourist destination for the mob and also a place where there are sugar plantations. We never stopped punishing Cuba for liberating itself from the treacherous, fascist, brutal dictatorship of Batista because he was our ally. And in that process, of course, Cuban development and Cuban governance has been fairly restrictive on any sort of sentiment that is against its government. You might not agree with it. I certainly don't agree with it either. But it's important to understand where that social and political repression comes from. It is impossible for an American to ever comprehend an infinitely larger country with awesome power, with the largest military on the planet, dominating its existence from the moment of revolution. It would be akin to the English Empire, British Empire, basically fucking dominating America, being on the ass cheeks of America and dominating America endlessly for the crime of having the American Revolution, okay? And never giving that up. So There's a reason for Cuban social and political repression. I would go so far as to say that the Chinese social and political repression is less necessary, even though they still maintain it. Anyway.
Addendum. This video isn't a commentary on whether North Korea is a good or bad country, quote unquote, whatever those labels mean. It's an exploration of why their perspective is the way it is, and any intellectually honest person would be interested in hearing the other side to see if it has merit. Let's continue. North Korea, officially called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, occupies the northern half of the Korean peninsula. It's supported by China, the Korean Bay, the Sea of Japan, and of course, South Korea. At 120,000 square kilometers in total area, the DPRK houses around 26 million people, with a significant portion residing in urban centers like the capital, Pyongyang.
I'll ping this 22-minute Cold War, this one? Oh, the Cold War video? Okay, a lot of people have suggested this Cold War video saying, South Korea, brutal dictatorship of the post-war period. But I think it's good to understand first how the partitioning happened and what the impact on North Korea was, and then we'll move on to South Korean political development as well.
The DPRK was officially founded in 1948 under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, establishing a central ideology called Juche, or self-reliance, which has served as a guiding philosophy of sorts for the nation. North Korea's anti-imperial stance is deeply rooted in its early 20th century history, when it was just known as Korea. Long before the US was the imperialist enemy of North Korea, Japan brutally occupied the entire peninsula from 1910 to 1945, a period marked by severe repression, forced assimilation, and sex slavery, an issue of contention with Japan to this day. Policies of forced labor, limited political freedoms for Koreans, and
Japan refused to acknowledge the comfort women. It's a big point of contention in Japanese politics.
mandatory participation in Shinto rituals were calculated to erase the native spiritual practices and
this is what I was going to say, that was left out of the original video of like the practice of erasing Korean identity and Korean culture, which plays a pretty formative role.
Culture of Korea. Yet Koreans resisted, reclaiming traditional practices, and ultimately refused to bow down to Japanese imperial demands. After World War II, Korea was arbitrarily divided by the US after realizing that a free and open democratic election would result in an overwhelming Communist Party victory, much like in Germany following World War II. That definitely didn't suit the US, so they instead created a puppet state in what became South Korea, now the Republic of Korea. And while doing this under the guise of defending democracy and freedom, they would install a brutal dictator named Syngman Rhee, an anti-communist exile who barely spent any time in Korea. This is juxtaposed by Kim Il-sung, the man who would go on to lead the DPRK, who had spent his life in the anti-Japanese struggle and for Korean independence.
The problem is with the likes of Kim Il-sung, and this is a thing that you see in many other countries in much more personal ways, but you know, sometimes you have fail sons, and then those fail sons have other fail sons, and you inevitably end up, especially if you have like direct next of kin lineage in terms of like who gets to govern, you end up kind of fucking up the bag a little bit.
The conflict widened in scope when the Soviet Union and China intervened on the side of their ally, with the US doing the same for South Korea. This division set the stage for the Korean War, the first proxy war of the Cold War. Syngman Rhee, a dependable pro-Western puppet, was ruling half the Korean peninsula. Despite his total lack of local support, the first thing he did was suppress the incredibly popular left, much like Suharto would go on to do in Indonesia, always with American support, of course. Check out the Jakarta method.
Jakarta method is...
Rhee did so enthusiastically and systematically. Under Rhee and the US's occupation of South Korea, only those deemed irrelevant...
Listen, we just gave them the coordinates and who we suspected of being communists. We didn't tell them that they should use the guns that sometimes they got from us on their unsuspecting civilian population. How could we have known that they would slaughter millions of people? How could we have known that? We simply gave them lists of names of suspected communists. Who could have thought that they would end up slaughtering every single person, of suspected communist allegiances? And this doesn't mean that they were slaughtering card-carrying communists that were trying to engage in militancy, okay? They were slaughtering motherfuckers who were like, yeah, I think women and men should be equal. They were slaughtering people. Many of them were involved in student protests and student organizing. They were slaughtering people who wanted to engage in any sort of any sort of like pro-democracy initiative, for example. So a lot of this stuff doesn't stop with, and I obviously personally would consider it ridiculous and inhumane to just go and be like, oh yeah, you're suspected as a communist, or you're a card-carrying communist, so you deserved execution. Okay, I don't think that that is appropriate either. But it didn't even go, it went far beyond that. They would just kill intellectuals. They would kill people for the crime of saying like, yeah, I don't know if we should do this. It never stops with just the communists. So even if you are some doughy-eyed social democrat who's like, well, I don't know, maybe some of these communists deserve it, just remember that like they killed the social democrats as well. This is how it usually works. They do not want any sort of fucking opposition whatsoever. Yeah, teachers and unions with no official political ideology were sexually harassed by guards and brutalized. Some were minors.
Reliable or loyal, by American standards, had any place in Korean politics. By 1946, the US military dictatorship in South Korea had filled all of its government positions with right-wing elites to the exclusion of popular worker and peasant movements. And by exclusion, I mean by imprisoning their leaders, pushing them underground, or just outright killing them. This violent suppression led to the isolation of all opposition, and left a single party to rule the South. But any democracy was just for show, since liberals love political theater, and the US wanted to play dress-up with political legitimacy. Despite this, many South Koreans continued to support socialist ideals and continued to be imprisoned for it. Meanwhile, in the North, reforms that were begun prior to American intervention were happening fast. Within months, North Korea abolished landlords, redistributed land, and nationalized industries, exactly the kind of necessary overhaul that had long been called for by Koreans for a liberated Korea. It is and was a formula that actually works to end poverty for the widest base of society. Unlike the violent repression in the South, the North's transformation was quick and efficient, creating a government aligned with local aspirations rooted in Korean culture. And like clockwork, anytime the US sees a project not aligned with its interests take root and begin to bear fruit, it tries to cut it down and turn it into wood chips. Here enters the Korean War, where over the next few years, American forces dropped an estimated 635,000 tons of bombs across Korea, with the majority of that hitting the North, including 32,000 tons of napalm. More bombs hit Korea than Japan in World War II, which is quite a feat. The core history of the conflict is complicated, and who begun the war with what actions depends on which action you consider critical for sparking the conflict. Watch the following video for further detail, or check out the fantastic work Patriots, Traitors, and Empires, The Story of Korea's Struggle for Freedom by Goans for a deeper dive. Anyway, the goal was obvious, to destroy North Korea's industrial capacity and to break the will of its people. Cities like Pyongyang were leveled to the point that civilians had to take refuge in caves to survive the onslaught. In fact, the total amount of destruction rendered practically every city of the North completely flattened. I made a video that covered this in further detail here. By 1952, North Korea was left in ruins. Bombings destroyed crucial infrastructure, creating massive shortages in food, housing, and basic supplies. Entire communities survived in caves, shanties, or improvised shelters. The destruction of hydroelectric dams led to widespread flooding, crippling agriculture even further. Fertilizer factories were among the many targeted, contributing to an agricultural crisis that left North Korea on the brink of famine. The toll from this collection of circumstances was utterly devastating. Approximately 2 million North Koreans had died, most of them civilians who fell victim to US bombs and starvation, in just a few short years. These strategic bombings weren't just meant to win a war. They were intended to systematically dismantle North Korea's ability to survive independently. As a result of this extensive bombing and napalming, only a small percentage of North Korea's agricultural land remains arable today. The 1953 armistice only ended active military combat, but it left the peninsula in limbo. South Korea refused to sign the armistice, but
this was also considered formative for the Dahia Doctrine as well. I think Hakim in his video, it might have been Hakim or someone else that we watched that talked about how like prior American military doctrine led the Israeli military in applying the Dahia Doctrine into the way that they wage war, where it's like, it doesn't matter if it's a small group of people, it doesn't matter if there's any sort of like militant uprising. The goal there is to punish the entire population by universalizing the pain. This is the way that America wages war. This is the way that Israel wages war as well, where the goal is to basically destroy all matter of civilian life in an effort to ensure that there is never any sort of like uprising ever again.
operations. The US later signed a mutual defense treaty with its loyal puppet South Korea, committing to a permanent military presence along the fortified 38th parallel, which remains one of the most militarized borders in the world today. The ongoing US presence has only deepened the divide. For North Koreans, the memory of the US invasion and the destruction it caused is an integral part of their identity. The systematic devastation of neighborhoods, infrastructure, and food supplies has been ingrained in North Korean consciousness as a proof of American aggression. That's not forgetting the 10 to 20% of the population that was killed as a result. Understanding this context is crucial. It's why North Korea sees the US as a central obstacle to peace, independence, and unification on the Korean peninsula. And they happen to be correct about that point. The Korean War is only the beginning of the story. The United States went further and has waged a decades-long economic war that's made it increasingly difficult for the people living in North Korea to survive. One of the primary tools America uses to get their way is sanctions. These economic blockades are designed to cripple a nation, isolate it from the world, and bring about conditions of change favorable to American foreign policy, all while framing the oppression as a morally justified response to rogue behavior.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
And all of this happens without any reflection that, at a certain point, sanctions just become collective punishment which should be against international law and is technically a war crime. This is especially true when it comes to US sanctions on North Korea. The US, in its arrogance, has behaved as if controlling North Korea's economy through sanctions was some kind of divine right. During Clinton's regime, the US unleashed severe economic sanctions on 35 countries, which at the time affected 42% of the world's population, having lethal consequences on a mass scale due to basic living standards plummeting under the guise of protecting global security, a favorite liberal trope. This tactic isn't new or unique. It's an ancient strategy that involves starving a subject population into submission and manipulating public sentiment against their government. In other words, it's extortion on a mass scale, or terrorism, or whatever other term that's valid. Yet North Korea's people have proven to be tremendously resilient, which renders sanctions ineffective and makes sanctions even crueler than they already are. Instead of fermenting dissent, sanctions have only fueled a fierce collective defiance reinforced against the US and its allies. Take it from me, an Iraqi. No one in Iraq has ever felt that the Iraqi government is responsible for the suffering imposed on it by the American sanctions regime.
This is a very normal tendency for people to harden their position against those who actually cripple them and destroy them.
The severe...
I always say sanctions can only work on your allies, and the mere threat of sanctions is enough for your ally to stop their bad behavior. Sanctions end up never really working on your enemies. At least if the goal is like overthrowing a regime.
And deep and enduring anti-Americanism in Iraq is a direct result of American policies in the region and particularly in my country. It's no different in Syria, in Libya, in Afghanistan, or in the DPRK. One of the most destructive aspects of US sanctions for North Korea is the carefully calculated restriction of essential medical and humanitarian supplies. For example, under the 2017 sanctions, any metal products were broadly prohibited, which meant that medical shipments that included essential sterilization tools, like aluminum steam sterilizers used in reproductive health kits and surgical instruments, were effectively not allowed entry into the DPRK. By blocking something as basic as this, any and all public health efforts are made harder or even impossible, since hospitals have a harder time keeping conditions hygienic enough to perform safe procedures. Worse still, North Korean hospitals cannot obtain spare parts for essential devices like CT scanners, ventilators, and X-ray machines without applying for some special export license, and even these are often denied or face long delays. And of course, the US has sanctions on fuel, like refined petroleum and diesel fuel. Those fuels power hospital generators, heating facilities, and running medical equipment. Again, rural hospitals have been hit harder and are forced to reduce operations during the winter months, which leaves pregnant women, young children, and elderly patients at risk. Without vital medical equipment, such as respirators running, many completely avoidable deaths occur, which they wouldn't were it not for US sanctions. Despite...
Someone said, why couldn't they get this from the USSR? Dog, what do they have, time machines? It fell at this point. America won. They used to. It's kind of a big part of this conversation, is that they used to. It's just that it no longer exists at this point. And they got fucking massive famines and drought, flooding and then drought.
Despite these sanctions, however, the DPRK has against all odds formed a model healthcare system for low-income countries, in comparison to that of the wealthiest country on Earth, which guarantees basically nothing in terms of healthcare for its citizens, despite profiting handsomely from spreading misery around the globe. Moving on. For all the criticism leveled at the DPRK for censorship and not letting people contact the outside world, much of it is warranted, they conveniently leave out the fact that even telecommunications infrastructure is sanctioned by the US. Until recently, even something as simple as making a phone call across the border was hampered by sanctions because a direct connection wasn't allowed. In this case, a South Korean company operating in the Kaesong industrial complex had to reroute calls through China at an exorbitant rate of $3.60 per minute due to US restrictions. I don't think most Americans would pay $3.60 per minute for a phone call, let alone citizens of impoverished third world countries. You don't need to take my word for it. The United Nations says economic sanctions exacerbate poverty, disproportionately impact vulnerable populations, and generate unethical business practices that exploit scarcity. Unfortunately, North Korea is no exception. NGOs and humanitarian agencies that help in providing basic necessities to North Koreans state that they are restricted from operating efficiently, often due to long searches and other delays because of US sanctions. These sanctions go against the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which condemns punishments of civilians for the actions of its government. And yet that's exactly what the sanctions do, as we've seen. Food and medical supplies are held up, delayed, or outright blocked. In one absurd case, it took an NGO over a year to deliver just 16 boxes of beans to North Korea. This blatant disregard for humanitarian concerns proves the US is more interested in the systematic punishment of an entire people for the so-called crime of having the wrong government or for being born in the wrong country. Take your pick. A UNICEF report in 2018 estimated that 200,000 North Korean children suffered from acute malnutrition, with 60,000 at risk of starvation because of the delays in humanitarian aid. To remind you, agricultural tools and inputs are also sanctioned by the US, adding on top of the bulk of the arable land being ruined by American bombing runs in the 1950s. This is the definition of shooting someone in the leg and then blaming them when they can't walk. The fact that this suffering is largely ignored by—
There's also a limited amount of arable land in every country to begin with, okay? Like, that's the reason why you do trade. And if you're completely blocked out of all semblance of trade from the rest of the planet because of the largest imperial force on the fucking planet, then yeah, you're cooked. What are you supposed to do? Eat the fucking rocks? It's very fucked up.
By the international community, never called out for being the crime that it is, only strengthens the DPRK's case and perspective against the US, as they witness firsthand the human cost of these cruel and pointless sanctions. If anyone truly cared about human rights in the DPRK, they'd immediately call for the lifting of economic sanctions. Sanctions on North Korea don't just target the government, I think that's clear. They seep into every layer of society and erode the living standards of ordinary citizens. In fact, that is the stated goal of many of the sanctions. For example, the textile industry is one of North Korea's main sources of employment and has been hit very hard by sanctions. Exports are blocked, which means thousands of textile workers, many of whom are women, find themselves unemployed or with reduced income. As a result, many are forced into black market activities to afford everyday necessities like food and clothing. Fishing is another critical industry and food resource nearly severed by sanctions, wiping out a sector that once provided a stable income for many coastal communities for centuries. No access to export markets means a cap on just how much they can catch and viably benefit from. This destabilizes local economies along the coast, along with all downstream industries such as fish processors, transporters, and vendors who rely on fishing industry for their livelihood. Other fuels and metals like coal and iron ore, North Korea's primary exports, have also felt the wrath of sanctions. In 2018, China's imports of North Korean coal dropped by 88% due to international sanctions, which stripped North Korea of a major and badly needed source of income. By now, you should know the pattern. The US sanctions a commodity, the decline in business forces closures of production facilities, and all downstream production is similarly affected. It's the same story with coal mines and associated facilities, which resulted in more unemployment and further impoverished communities. These are not luxury industries or military projects. They are, or were, the backbone of North Korea's civilian economy. Without access to global markets, North Koreans are forced to use black markets, where prices for things even as basic as food can be prohibitively expensive. And to wrap up, let's stay on the employment issue. The labor market is severely restricted as a result of what was said previously, but also because of sanctions that take away access to joint employment opportunities. In essence, you can't invest in North Korea. An example of this trend is the shutdown of the Kaesong industrial complex. It was a large joint north-south facility that employed over 50,000 North Koreans and a symbol of friendship between the South and the North. The shutdown, because of sanctions, resulted in these 50,000 North Koreans being under or unemployed. These are nefarious policies aimed at maximizing misery for the interests of American capital. The United States has likewise kept a military stranglehold on the Korean Peninsula for decades, with roughly 28,000 troops stationed at a few large bases across South Korea meant to counter any potential aggression from the north. This isn't a temporary deployment, and it's extremely expensive, for South Korea, of course. The US isn't altruistic even to its allies. In a recent deal, South Korea agreed to pay over $1.1 billion, with further increases capped at 5% per year, to host the US military presence, a price pushed by the Biden administration to solidify a deal before any possible disruption from the second Trump administration. This new agreement lasts until 2030 to make absolutely sure that it survives past Trump into whatever administration follows him. For North Korea, these forces are there as a threat, obviously. It's the most technically sophisticated military on Earth and its local ally, stationed across the border against your sanctioned and small country. It can be nothing else. Anyway, each year, the US and South Korea carry out joint military so-called exercises, training in everything from missile defense to simulated invasion drills. One of the most extensive, Ulchi Freedom Shield, involved a combination of computer-simulated and live-fire exercises, with some 19,000 South Korean soldiers participating in drills against North Korean attack scenarios, essentially joint US-South Korean invasion exercises. This isn't really a war game, it's a display of power backed up by the increased presence of US long-range nuclear-armed bombers, submarines, and strike groups in the region. Who is the aggressor here, again? North Korea has responded predictably, positioning their nuclear program as an essential deterrent against American aggression. If Iraq had done the same, then we would still be an independent country, and without the excess of 1 million deaths caused by the illegal American invasion. Despite official US claims that regime change
HasanAbi doctrine, get the nukes.
Isn't the objective, statements and strategies of several US regimes suggest otherwise. North Korea watched other states like Libya dismantle their defenses only to face regime change at the hands of the US. If the DPRK were to disarm, it would likely face a similar fate, being exposed to an aggressive enemy that has historically favored extreme and unrelenting force over diplomacy. So, we should really view North Korea's nuclear deterrent more as a survival strategy against an American military presence than the unhinged world-ending musings of a psychopath. Likewise, and more importantly, they offer to stop nuclear testing entirely for a pledge that
Loki, if Ukraine never gave up its nukes, I think it'd be a dramatically different situation right now.
That the US wouldn't attack. The US ignored the memo, of course. This is one of the many extended olive branches from the north that have gone ignored. Western media's portrayal of the DPRK as a rogue state is a framing used by imperialist powers to vilify nations that defy their hegemony, and also serve as a source of circular logic that itself assumes the US wouldn't lie about something like that for political gain, despite that literally being the point. In this narrative, North Korea is depicted as a dangerous, irrational actor, a threat to global and regional stability, and an obstacle to progress. Progress as defined and measured by what is most profitable to Western capital interests, interestingly enough. Let's not forget the trillions of dollars worth of rare earth metals under North Korean soil. We even made a video on that you can check out here. Few analysts or policymakers attempt to actually understand how the DPRK perceives American aggression, preferring to push a simplistic, cartoonish, and unserious one-sided image of the nation as a villain beyond redemption. This framing is used to block or at least slow down any genuine resolution, which makes sure the crisis continues to serve US imperial interests. However, if we strip away the nonsense, North Korea is being punished because it refuses to submit to globalized exploitation by Western powers, which makes it the ultimate enemy. The DPRK is described as reclusive, backward, and isolated, but no mention is made of the sanctions which hold that end as their explicit purpose. Yet the nation persists, defying expectations of collapse, relying on defense and small concessions extracted from an international community too cowardly to defy the US. Even when the US outwardly recognizes the need for negotiation, as in the Perry report, its approach and action still treat North Korea as inherently irrational and dangerous. This ideological project is not limited to the DPRK. Cuba, another country falsely labeled as a rogue state, and I've covered in this series here, has been resisting similar imperialist domination. Cuba is also painted as an unrepentant regime led by an irrational and dangerous group.
I would say Cuba and Korea have been presented in the same vein, but I think Cuba's a little bit better. I don't know. Like, Cuba has historically been able to withstand and develop in far better ways. Partially because they didn't have fucking, I guess, the mass famine. Yeah, better climate plays a role. Better agricultural outputs play a big role. They didn't get bombed into oblivion. But I'm saying, but this is post-90s, chat. Because North Korea was able to recover. North Korea was able to recover after the Korean War with the help of the USSR. That's why I'm saying, like, it's a little bit different from 90s onward.
Whose system must change to serve Western capital, of course. This rhetoric suggests these nations are so desperate to maintain power that they endanger their own populations and global stability, framing their survival as both an anomaly and a threat, as simultaneously weak and strong, like how fascists like to depict all their enemies. Instead of engaging with their histories, imperialist discourse reduces North Korea and Cuba to caricatures, presenting their leaders as the sole architects of their nation's problems and suffering. Be completely honest with yourself. Have you ever heard any talk about sanctions, or how they impact the average North Korean before this video, particularly in the Western press? I would bet on no. However, propaganda against the DPRK extends to more than just this. The US and its allies have also and continue to conduct direct campaigns. From propaganda leaflet bombs in the Korean War to balloons filled with anti-regime messages in US dollars sent from South Korea, attempts at undermining the country are ceaseless. That's aside from all these silliest claims that you see shared all over, with no sources as always. For an overview of that, check out my earlier video here. For further details on defectors and why their stories so frequently fall apart, check out another video here.
I think one of the funniest parts about this is that, like, there is an entire marketplace for defection, obviously, because people are fascinated by the hermit nation. But having said that, even all of the other people that have made a name for themselves in the defector orbit, some of which who literally are like, yo, this shit sucks, and then they sometimes want to go back because they don't have job opportunities in South Korea due to the same exact job market that, like, South Koreans have to withstand, but also because they additionally get profiled because they're North Korean and then sometimes leave and go back to North Korea. All of that fucking industry in unison, virtually every single person in the defector industry turned around and said, Yami Park is out of her fucking mind. Like, virtually every single person was like, yo, Yami Park, that lady is crazy. What the fuck are you guys talking about? What a time. What a fucking amazing time that was. One of my most vindicated long-standing criticisms. Okay, well, I don't care about the rest of this, but god damn, dude, holy shit.